well, she's over in the other building, but Debbie Rogers had a heart cath Friday, and they put about 3 stents in. She's here. And I think they actually had to repair one of the grafts that she already had put in. So, but anyway, she's here, probably walking a little gingerly. But let me mention to you, of course, as you can see, this font is a little small, and I apologize for that. Most of them will not be. Plus, I've changed the font on the outlines when I give you your new pages. So it's more readable. But our projector is also going out. It's going bad. So that's another reason that quality is not that great. So we're aware of the issue, and we're looking into purchasing a new projector. No, it's not cheap. You're probably talking about $5,000 or something. So, but they get better all the time. Actually, they're like any other technology. They get cheaper and better every time you buy a new one. So, probably a few years ago, they were $25,000. So, let me mention the latest publication from Apologetics Press, since we're here studying apologetics. They've just released their Defending the Faith Study Bible. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's unbelievable, really. It's New King James Version, but it is full of sections, different sections like the things we've been discussing on apologetics. But then in the text itself, it is full of footnotes. And I have some kind of, where's the key here? They have a topical icon legend for their footnotes. And they have about 6 different categories: creation, Bible inspiration, existence of God, deity of Christ, alleged Bible discrepancies, and world religions. And that's in their footnotes. And then they have separate sections just on, like here's one here, a whole 2 pages in pretty small print. Did God approve of Rahab's lie? You know, things of that nature. Did God approve of Rahab's lie? That's just a section. Here's a section on, I mean, you come across these things as you're going through it, but for instance, here's a section on remarkable laws of food consumption. We'll talk about that in our study as well. But a lot of the things we're going to be talking about, they've got, pretty extensive sections on them in this new study Bible. I don't know how many hours went into putting this thing together, but it's a hardback, and they kept the price as low as they can. I mean, that thing I don't know what it should retail for, but they're selling them for $39.95. So now, if you give to them if you're a regular contributor on a monthly basis, they've already sent you one. I got one in the mail. I didn't pay a dime for it. Well, I did pay for it, but anyway, you can order it from Apologetics Press. You just go online and order it. So, I would recommend it next time you're looking for a Bible. And I apologize for you folks in the balcony. I'm getting threatening text. No, I'm just joking. They're not threatening. They're informative text messages. Well, I set these things, and then somebody comes behind me. See, I set these on a certain amount, and then I look again, and somebody's raised the temperature. So I don't know who's playing with it besides me. But if you're playing with the thermostat, quit, please. Yes, that's what I need. It could be set on some kind of automatic thing too. I don't know. That's not my area. I've turned it down again, so we'll see. I'm hot down here. I can't imagine what it's like up there. All right. We were in Roman numeral 5 at the bottom of page 2 of your outline, going over the top of page 3. Why people suffer. We noticed last week, the obvious existence of suffering natural disasters we mentioned, man's inhumanity to man. What else did we talk about besides that? Causeless suffering, that is seemingly random, innocent suffering. People inherit things from their, they get genes and things from their parents that cause illness and sickness. We talked about freak accidents, automobile accidents, people drowning. And, people get the wrong idea about suffering. They think every time something happens that it's got to be somebody's fault. And the apostles asked Jesus who sinned, this man or his parents, talking about the blind man. Jesus said on one occasion, we mentioned in Luke chapter 13, some told Jesus about the Galileans whom Pilate mixed their blood with their sacrifices. He said, well, do you think they were any worse than anybody else just because these things happened to them? What about those 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell? Do you think that they were sinners above all those in Jerusalem just because bad things happened to them? And so the world is drenched in misery, agony, heartache, suffering. And so the atheist says, well, why do bad things happen to good people? Does God really exist? How can He stand by if He's all love and powerful and let these things go on? And frankly, then the question comes, why would He create such a place to begin with? What's his deal? And of course, we admit that no, we don't have all the answers to suffering, but sometimes that's a cop-out to say that we don't have all the answers, when in fact the Bible gives us a lot of information on why we suffer, logical, satisfactory explanations that only the Christian worldview can offer. And so, we mentioned last week there in your outline, unsatisfactory approaches. I think that's kind of where we left off. But, to the atheist and evolutionist, suffering, like everything else in the universe, is ultimately meaningless, without purpose, which seems strange. And of course, because of that belief, suffering just elicits a lot of weird responses from people, from puzzlement to anger to resentment. And frankly, most people then spend their lives trying to avoid it, number one, and then not talk about it. Most people in the world don't want to seriously talk about sin. They don't want to talk about death, certainly, or what comes afterwards. It's just kind of something you ignore. And that's the opposite of what suffering is telling us. So the astrologer and the psychic and all of those folks say, well, it's just fate, it's pre-programmed. The Buddhist and the Hindu, life is cyclical and you're just coming back trying to correct the mistakes you made in the prior life. The problem with that, of course, is that you don't remember the mistakes you made in the prior life. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. How could you correct them? And the Bible is clear in Hebrews that it's appointed unto men, what? Once to die. There's no such thing as reincarnation. And the world makes the wrong assumptions. We'll talk about that as we go through here. But the only approach that does satisfy, as it mentions here in this outline, is the Christian worldview. It is the only one that answers the longings of the human spirit, if you will. So as we get into this subject, there are some basic foundational truths that we have to realize, and that's part of what this study is about. I can know that God exists. We just talked about 7 lines of evidence in that regard. We're going to get to this next section later on, but I can know that the Bible is His inerrant, inspired Word. And the third foundational plank upon which this study of suffering is based is that the Bible teaches that our life on earth is temporary and will end at death. As I mentioned before, the world, what is the world's conclusion, since this world our life here is temporary and it ends at death? What does then the world conclude? What is the result of that? How does that affect their life? That's it. It's the old beer commercial. You only go around once in life. Well, the Bible's clear about that. It's appointed unto men once to die. You only go around once in life, but the beer commercial, the worldview says what? Grab all the gusto. That's not what the Bible, that's not what God is trying to teach us with suffering and the temporary nature of this life. And the Bible is the only reliable guide for ascertaining the meaning of life and human existence. And so we have to begin this study, as you see there in number 3, under A, what is life all about? What is the purpose of the universe? What is it? What is the purpose of this life? Now, before that, that's what is the purpose of this environment in which we live? Why are we placed here? What's being determined? That's what we should be doing, but what is the whole purpose of the whole thing? Why have we been put in this environment? What is determination is being made? Well, some of us. It's broader than that. The whole purpose of it is for everyone in the created order to determine where they will spend eternity. This is a probationary period. That's the purpose of this physical environment in which we live. It is a realm of spirit preparation. Because of that, we have to have access to all the features, elements, and characteristics of an environment that enables us to be truly free to make our own choices with respect to our eternal destiny. We have to have free will and to be able to exercise our own volition and personal decision making, because that's what determines it. And so when God creates beings in His own image and objects of His infinite love, they have to have certain attributes. This is from the writings of Brother Warren. What are those attributes? Number 1, free moral agency. These are essential attributes of humanness. 2, immortality and ongoing existence beyond the physical realm. 3, culpability, Brother Rufus, or accountability, as you like to say, for one's own actions. Physical life that is spent in a physical realm, number 4, is the one and only probationary period. And 5, recognition that a person's eternal fate is determined by his or her response to the God of heaven. And these attributes are designed to go hand in hand with the essential characteristics of a spirit-preparing world. Bottom line is, God tailored this world to be the perfect place for us to live and exercise our free moral agency and determine where we're going to live. People ask the question, why can't God just, right across the sky or make an appearance? Well, He did make an appearance. Terry Duke wrote a book called God at a Distance. God has kept Himself at just like the earth is the perfect distance from the sun. There's no other planet in our solar system that can sustain life. It's either too hot or too cold. The earth at 93 million miles is just the right distance that we don't burn up or freeze to death. God has kept Himself at just the right distance that He does not interfere with our free moral agency, and yet we have everything that we need to know to make the right decisions. He has done all He can do to encourage us to make the right decisions. So, this earthly environment was designed, number 1, per Brother Warren's writings, to supply humans with their basic physical needs. Number 2, allow for our free moral agency. Number 3, allow us to be challenged. And 4, and this is where suffering comes in, maybe some in 3 too, allow humans to learn the things they most need to learn, including spiritual development. So, we keep all these things in mind, then we can make a little more sense of the role of suffering plays in this world. So this next phrase, number 4 in your outline, comes from the English poet John Keats, 1795 to 1821. This phrase you see over and over again in Brother Warren's writings and in other apologists. Here's what John Keats said: "Call the world, if you please, quote, the veil of soul making. Then you will find out the use of the world. How then are souls to be made? How but by the medium of a world like this? Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul? A place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways." We are in the midst of a probationary period. And this reason trumps all other purposes of life. Well, what does the wisest man in the world have to say about it? Wisest man that ever lived. There in your outline. Y'all remember Solomon's treatise, Ecclesiastes, which actually talks about this principle. Ecclesiastes, or you know that Solomon was, that's kind of his autobiography. And that autobiography reports things of his life in the early chapters of 1 Kings. And because of his wealth and his intelligence, he was able to immerse himself in all the vicissitudes of life, all the endeavors that people do, devote themselves to, and experiment about life's purpose. What are some of the things that he sought out? Anybody? If you go into Ecclesiastes or the first few chapters of 1 Kings, okay? Toil, hard work, labor, monumental construction projects. How long did it take him to build his own? Is this thing going in and out? I do. Is that messing it up? All right, let's try that. Good to have you up here at the front. How long did it take him to build his own house? Anybody? 13 years. That's just a fraction of the things that he built. Extensive irrigation system, as Connie mentioned, gardens, orchards, groves, vineyards, a fleet of ships. He sought to inquire, number 2, knowledge, intelligence, wisdom, insight. He was a poet, an author, a composer, a lyricist. Thousands of proverbs, musical compositions. He was qualified as a botanist, zoologist, ornithologist, entomologist, you name it, he studied it. Wealth and possessions, servants, herds, flocks, silver, gold, right? Constantly being brought to him. Gifts being brought to him. Read about his throne, his armchair. Made of ivory and overlaid with pure gold. 6 steps with lions, gold lions on it. Nothing like it says, in any kingdom. Great military capability, chariots, horsemen. He put them in all these storage cities. Had a labor force from survivors of conquered nations. Political power, ruled over a considerable geographical area. That was the farthest that the Israelite Empire went, all the way to the Euphrates, really. And he received tribute from all of those vassal kings. Unprecedented fleshly activities. Guy had 1,000 women. Wilt Chamberlain had nothing on him. In fact, Wilt Chamberlain probably made up most of his. But not Solomon. He gave attention to resisting the aging process, Ecclesiastes 11 and 12. Is our culture interested in that? Resisting the aging process? You ever look at, every time my wife opens a paper or sees something on TV, she says, look at that, actor from years gone by. Man, they've had a lot of surgery done. You can tell it. So alcohol, other forms of physical stimulation, alcohol and laughter and mirth. Basically, Solomon said in this book, I've had it all, I've seen it all, I've done it all. And yet he said it's vanity, chasing after the wind, all of these things under the sun. That means without taking God in part of your perspective. When you leave Him out. And frankly, there was a lot of his endeavors, and there's a lot of things that people get involved in today that are noble efforts. Nothing wrong with them. In fact, some of them are very good things. Worthwhile things. But there's no human endeavor of any ultimate value unless it takes God into consideration. And so you know his conclusion, Ecclesiastes 12. Fear God, keep His commandment, literally, for this is man's all. It's the whole of man. Our reason for existence. Your money, your possessions, the fame, the power, the intelligence, the youthfulness, the pleasure, the toil, the advancement. That's all meaningless, Solomon said, if you do it apart from the Creator. And so the only way we truly make sense of everything in life, including our suffering, is to understand this principle. And logically, it makes sense. Here's another quote from Brother Warren. The creation of a being who would have descendants like himself, who would be capable of entering into fellowship with Him, who would be capable of becoming a son of God, who thus would have to be capable of deciding freely to believe Him, to love Him with all of his heart, to submit to Him in obedience, and whom God could love and eventually glorify. That's essentially God's purpose for creating the environment in which we live. Make us more like Him, to get us ready to live with Him, to achieve that purpose. And that means sometimes being subjected to very tragic and unpleasant events. And we're going to look at some of the many causes of those events as we get further in your outline. But keep in mind, because of the environment in which we live, we're going to come back to this verse more than once. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, nothing has happened to you that is not what? Common to man. And he says in that verse, when you start taking the attitude, I've heard people say this, when you start saying, you don't understand, nobody, it's like the old spiritual, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. When you start talking like that, he says, you're close to falling. Because there is nothing that you're ever going to undergo that people haven't already suffered and undergone. Don't think you're special. Don't think you're different. Everybody suffers. And so when these disasters occur and bad things happen, we can't point at God and pronounce Him blameworthy because He had a morally justifiable reason for creating the world this way. Because our existence here is not permanent. It's temporary, and it's for the development of our spirit. And frankly, all of these things are telling the world, and they're telling people, no, life's not about getting all the gusto. What God's trying to tell us is that life is short, and it's uncertain, and you could go any minute. Therefore, the purpose of life is to what? Get ready for that moment. Get ready for that moment when you leave this world. That's what He's telling us with this environment. Not go out and do everything you want and ignore Him. He's saying, get ready to meet me. Because we're all, according to the New Testament, going to stand before Him in what? Judgment. That's the purpose of the environment in which we live. Life's brief. It's uncertain. You need to distinguish the temporary from the permanent. And frankly, the things that are permanent, you don't see. Most of the things you can see and feel with your senses are not permanent. In fact, I don't know if any of them are. It's a physical universe in which we live, and it's going to be burned up. We have to contemplate our own fragility and finitude. And so we as Christians understand that no matter how bad things are, these things fit into the overall framework of soul making, preparing us for our departure. And the last thing that we need to understand from this introductory material on suffering is that suffering, because of what we've just talked about then, suffering in and of itself, bad things, tragic things, disasters, in and of themselves are not intrinsically evil. There is only one thing in this world that is intrinsically evil, and that is what? Violating the nature of God is the only intrinsic evil in this world. Violating the nature of God, sin. So, let's talk about some of the causes. When I say causes, things in this physical world in which we live that cause our suffering. Now that we've talked about the foundational meaning and purpose of the environment in which we live, there's some sub-causes of suffering. That's the overall reason for suffering, to prepare us for eternity. But what about the sub-causes? The things that come under this broader umbrella of soul making? Well, number one, as you see in your outline, which is really B, is what? Our decisions and their consequences. Our decisions and their consequences. The number one cause of human suffering is sin. And what is sin? 1 John 3:4. Violation of God's law. And by the way, what is sin can only be determined by God and by His Word. Nothing else is. We can't make things sinful that aren't sinful, and we can't make things right that are sinful. Bible. It's the Word of God that determines what's sinful and what's not sinful. And so it has a direct... In other words, sin only occurs in relationship or in relation to our relationship with God. It's between us and Him. And a great deal of suffering comes from generated by human sin, right? Free moral agents. We brought it into the world. Prisons are full of people who suffer because of their own decisions. Physical illness and disease, sometimes from illicit use of drugs, alcohol, tobacco, illicit sex, all that kind of thing. Our own decisions. So, number one, our own sin. Suffering from sin comes from two sources, obviously our own and other people's. Peter said in 1 Peter 4:15 what? Let none of you what? Suffer. As a what? Yeah, don't suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or a busybody in other people's matters. See, that's your own sin. You're suffering because of things you did. Yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to talk about that on this next category, but absolutely right. The fellow that comes home drunk and beats his wife and his kids has affected them. He's going to affect his employer. He's going to, and frankly, the rest of us, you know, I know that the alcohol industry is considered to be a great economic driver. I don't know how much money is made off alcohol. But I can almost guarantee you that the money that's made off alcohol doesn't pay for the money we spend on the effects of alcohol. Whether it's medical care or prisons or whatever it might be. Social services, we're spending billions, we've spent trillions on the problems that it's caused. Cost us all. So we suffer because of our own choices. Hosea 8:7, we sow the wind and we do what? We reap the whirlwind. We sow to the flesh, Galatians 6:8, and we reap corruption. But then number 2, it mentions in your outline the sin of others, and that's what Brother Rufus was talking about. Look at, Exodus 20 verse 5. You know, the Israelites came out of Egypt, that generation, 10 times God says, you've rebelled against me, you've caused me trouble. And therefore, the last time is the last straw, and you're going to do what? What was that generation going to have to do? Wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they all died. Now, question. The only people that were affected by those people's sin was those people. Look over at Numbers chapter 14. Look at Numbers chapter 14. Look at verse 33. Now he's talking to those people. Now look at verse 31. But your little ones whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. Well, that's great. Yeah, they get to go in. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, and your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years. And notice this phrase, and bear the brunt of your infidelity. Who's going to bear the brunt of the infidelity of these people? Their children. Their children. I mean, yeah, the children got to go in, but I'm 19 years old. Hey, I get to go in the promised land. How old am I when I get there? I'm almost 60 years old. Did I bear the brunt of my dad's sin? Absolutely. It's destructive. And we can suffer because of, frankly, people suffer because of generations long before them and their sins. And God said, in many places, I will visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the what? 3rd and 4th generation. Sin has consequences. And then somebody hollers, well, that's just not fair. And I think we all are smart enough to know that life's not fair. Right? But that still doesn't reflect on God's justice or make Him blameworthy, because the blame falls on the perpetrator. He's made this environment for our soul making. Free moral agency is mandatory. It's mandatory that we be free moral agents. And because of that, our decisions affect other people. And God can't miraculously intervene every time something bad's going to happen. Because number one, I mean, He's already done everything He can possibly do to discourage us from making bad choices. But number two, He can't interfere in our free will. And what kind of world would we live in? Somebody says, well, you know, the plane's about to fall out of the sky. God ought to just stop that. Well, then He would violate what? Gravity. The evolution, first of all, if God intervened every time something bad was going to happen, that would actually argue more for the evolutionist argument, who says that the world is going from what? It's going from chaos to order. The world is actually going from order to chaos. God set up an orderly system and universe, and therefore we can walk around and we can do our business every day knowing that gravity is always going to work the way gravity works. The sun's going to get up, or it's going to come up and set. All of the seasons are going to come around. We base all of our activities on these regular laws that God has put in place. And if He goes in interfering every time something's going to happen, then all we have is chaos. Which would point out to the fact that maybe there's no God. The New Testament says that God's a God of order. Therefore, you need to be orderly even in your worship. He told those people in Corinth. So, and if you suggest that somehow God can adjust this veil of soul making to eliminate pain and suffering, as one writer said, well, that's like putting the possibility of a round square or a 90-year-old teenager. It's an oxymoron. It's like jumbo shrimp. There are things that are nonsensical and self-contradictory. For instance, people used to ask that stupid question, can not God make a rock He cannot break? Well, that doesn't make sense. It's nonsensical and self-contradictory, and that's the position the atheist or agnostic is taking. Let me read you this from Brother Warren's book, Have Atheists Prove There Is No God? God is infinite in power. We talk about that all the time. But power meaningfully relates only to what can be done, to what is possible of accomplishment, not to what is impossible. It is absurd to speak of any power being able to do what simply cannot be done. Rather than saying that God cannot do such with the implication that He is deficient in power, so that if He only had more power He could do it, one should say that such simply cannot be done, that it is not subject to power, not even infinite power. Are there things that God cannot do? Absolutely, because there are things that cannot be done, period. For instance, can God lie? No. Does that mean He's not all-powerful? No. It's just that that's something that cannot be done. He can't lie. He can't violate His nature. So, it's self-contradictory. And when people exercise their free will and sin, it grieves God. He desires all men to be saved, right? 1 Timothy 2:4. All should come to repentance, 2 Peter 3:9. I like this passage from Ezekiel 18:23. Do I have any pleasure at all that the wicked should die, not that he should turn from his ways and live? No, God doesn't want us to die. He doesn't want us to die in our sins. He's done all that He can to discourage us to do the things that people do. But when people make decisions, bad decisions, they suffer for their own decisions, and when people make bad decisions, other people suffer for them. I suffer for them. I make bad decisions. Other people suffer for them. Here's another sub-cause of suffering, persecution. You know, sometimes the righteous are persecuted. Just the way they live evokes hatred and opposition from people that are living in sin. You remember Cain and Abel, right? Turn over to John chapter 3. This is going to happen. We'll have to finish with this. Pick up here next week. But look about verse 19. John chapter 3. And this is the condemnation, that the light is come and love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. Well, God didn't accept Cain's gift. Cain got angry. God gave him a pep talk, right? In Genesis chapter 4. What did God tell him? Why are you angry, Cain? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? You need to be careful. Sin lies at the door. Its desire is for you. And Cain rose up and slew his brother. And John chapter 3 verse 12 says, oh, let's see. I've lost my place. 1 John 3:12 says what? Why did Cain murder his brother? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. So there's going to be some suffering in the world due to the fact that evil people don't like righteous people. Even if you don't say a thing to them. They just don't like the way you live because it's a reflection on them. And they don't like being reminded that they're not living correctly. I mean, look what Nero did to Christians. Jesus said in John chapter 15, if the world hates you, know what? It hated me before it hated you. And look at the way it's treating me. You think you're going to get treated any better? John 16, he said, hey, they're going to put you out of the synagogues, and whoever kills you is going to think that he's doing God's service. But be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. We'll pick up there next week with Peter, 1 Peter 4:12. Don't think it's strange. Don't think it's unusual. Don't be surprised if you suffer. We may finish our discussion of suffering next week.